So appreciate running remote and everyone who's joining me here today, taking time out of your busy morning. I wanted to cover a topic that I get asked constantly about, which is how do you coach an employee, and especially remotely, right? When you're at a distance, when it's harder to judge tone, when it's harder to get a sense of those in-person cues, right, are missing, and how do you really support and coach your employee in that situation? And I will say that this is typically a topic that I spend 90 minutes going into. And so, because we have a limited amount of time, I'm going to get right to it. We're going to go straight to the good stuff. And there's likely going to be a feeling of me moving a little bit fast, right? And if there's any questions that you have as I go through this, please ask them. There's definitely parts that I purposely, just for the sake of time, didn't include, but really excited to share with you sort of the most foundational pieces as we think about a framework for how to coach an employee remotely. But first of all, I do want to share a little bit about who I am. So, as mentioned, my name's Claire, and I'm the CEO of Know Your Team. We are a software tool that helps remote managers become better. So we give you tools to run better one-on-one meetings, to build rapport in your remote team, to get status updates, and to get feedback. And the thing about Know Your Team and really how it came about is it's really based on this methodology of research. So we've spent the past some years actually, working with and surveying tens of thousands of managers, many of whom are remote. And it's from all that research that we developed this methodology that we put into the tool. And it's a lot of what I base the framework that I'm going to share with you today on too. So we have this tool. In addition to the tool, we actually in the tool have also a knowledge center with guides and live workshop sessions. And so the content that I'm sharing with you today is definitely taken from that, but just really excited again to take what I see as sort of the most pressing pieces as we think about how to coach an employee remotely and share them with the Running Remote community. So first of all, I have a question for each of you, which is I'm curious, has there ever been a time when someone has tried to be helpful to you and they actually weren't really that helpful? So, for example, perhaps it's a friend, right? Maybe they tried to give you advice. Maybe it's a parent, right? Maybe it's your partner or spouse, right? Maybe a coworker. I'd love for you to think about what that situation was. What was it about where they were trying to offer help, but it sort of backfired? It just wasn't really useful. And I will tell you, for me, family members often come to mind for this example personally. But then I would love to ask yourself if this has actually ever happened to you as a manager, because so many of us as managers, we want to be helpful, right? We want to give good advice. We want to give good direction and support. And yet, sometimes we actually are, in reality, not always helpful. And our intentions do not actually match the outcomes that end up coming from it. And so that's what we're going to talk about today is the fact that all of us, I have no doubt here, want to be helpful, want to be coaching and supporting our employees. And yet we're in reality not always that helpful. And so, like I mentioned, I'm going to be pulling from research that we've done over the past 6 years. In addition, research to that, we beyond of what we've done and scholars and academics have done for the past 20 years, as well as prior to running Know Your Team, I actually ran my own one-on-one coaching and consulting business. And so drawing from that experience and anecdotes as well. And specifically in the framework that I'm going to share today, I'm going to start off with actually talking about first what does not work when it comes to coaching. We'll cover that. Then I'm going to go into 4 pieces of what does work. As I mentioned, this framework usually actually includes 8 pieces, but for today and for the sake of time, I'm going to cover the most essential 4 things of what does work when thinking about coaching an employee remotely. And then we'll save a little time for Q&A. So let's dig in. In terms of what does not work, when it comes to being an effective manager, coaching our employee has to do with actually not exerting this feeling of pressure and control This absolutely does not work. And this is founded in the research of a really seminal scholar who spent the past, 20 to 30 years researching motivation. His name's Edward Deci. And in his work, he found that actually when you as a manager or even as a parent or as any kind of leader try to exert pressure or control on someone, it actually chips away at someone's intrinsic motivation to actually do the task, which means that it's not that when you try to control or pressure someone that you don't get the outcome done. Actually, a lot of times you do, but that's in the short run. And the really disastrous side effects is that over time, control actually backfires. So you might actually be trying to influence someone, control someone, right? Put a little pressure. You got to get this done, right? Especially when we're all working remotely these days, right? We need to hit this deadline. We need, putting that pressure, putting that control. And yes, it might be successful in the short run, but in the long run, actually performance worsens. The quality of the outcomes worsen as well over time. The person ends up actually learning less in the process, and the person actually doesn't even enjoy the task as much, and their intrinsic motivation to actually do the task is reduced. So when we think about how to avoid this, right? Or if we're, maybe reflecting for ourselves, is this something that I'm doing right now? There's a few things that you should sort of ask yourself. And one of them is to ask yourself, to what extent as a manager do I actually use controlling language, right? So for example, do I say things like you should, or you have to, or you ought to, right? Is that a part of your day-to-day communication in Slack pings or in your one-on-one Zoom conversations with your team? Because if so, that's a form of control. Another form of control is setting a lot of deadlines or very strict deadlines without any input from the team, right? And so if that's something that you've done in the past few weeks, no worries, no need to flagellate yourself or to feel to feel ashamed. That this is what the session is for. Is I'm going to share with you an alternative to doing this. For example, if you've said, oh, I need this ASAP, or we have to do this, or these are your goals, so now go, right? If you've actually exerted control in that way, well, we're going to talk about what a better way is. Another form of control that we actually don't recognize often as managers is if we dangle some kind of reward that is contingent on something being met. That's a form of control. That is, in fact, a form of pressure, because what we're doing is we're saying to someone, hey, you're only going to get this thing if you do this, right? And that is a form of control that is going to chip away at someone's intrinsic motivation. Now, control, aside from these examples that I share, can actually also manifest in more subtle ways. So, for example, if you only praise people when they do something good, period, right? Or when it's in your service, right? That's another form of control that's adding pressure, right? Based off something that is benefiting you personally, right? You're a rock star for completing this by the timeline I set. Or anytime you guilt your team, this is another subtle form of control. You say that, hey, everyone else is putting in this work, I'm doing this, right? That's a form of pressure that you're putting on that's going to chip away at that intrinsic motivation. And again, hey, maybe this is going to help you accomplish the things in the short term, but I know for so many of us as leaders and as managers, short-term results are short-lived success, right? And what we're really looking for is long-term success. And so I often will let folks know, okay, or rather when I share this with a lot of managers, they go, oh, Claire, I know that being controlling isn't good, and I try hard to avoid trying to exert pressure on my team. I think I'm pretty good. Well, if that's the case, excellent. And also, I do want to share a few more signs. These are actually what I see as sort of the biggest signs of micromanagement, the biggest signs of exerting too much pressure, exerting too much control, that maybe you still may be accidentally committing. And so one of them is if you ask your team, hey, I'm just checking in on this before a project is due. That's actually a sign of micromanagement. Or another one is if you say, here's how I would do it before a person actually asks you how they would do it. Or maybe in this remote world, you actually mentally log when someone appears online or offline, right? You wait to see their little green dot appear in the chat room, and that's actually a form of control that you are trying to exert on someone, as well as when you just say, "Let me do it," right? I can just, you guys can work at something else. I can just figure this out. Just let me do it. or when you ask someone to CC you on something where you actually necessarily didn't really need to be CC'd. All forms of control, all forms of micromanagement. And if you find yourself nodding your head going, oh man, maybe I am actually exerting more control on my team than I even thought I was, you're in the right place. I'm going to talk about alternatives for what to do instead. Because here's the thing, this is super natural, right? I find myself as a CEO and someone who's been studying, right, this topic for literally a decade, and find myself that it's really hard to figure out, how do I coach and support my team without coming across, without being counterproductive, right? Without coming across as being too controlling and hurting actually my team's intrinsic motivation. And I just have to remember that, trying to make this effort is important because of so many of these unintentional outcomes that happen. So now let's talk about the flip of this, right? How is it that we can find a way to get work done that is urgent, right? How is it that we can let someone know that something is actually important? How do we ensure that just the work gets done or that a team member can improve? How do we do all of this, right? How do we manage well without exerting control? It's actually a really difficult sort of quandary to figure out. So good news, there are alternatives. There is a better way. There is a better way to get work done that is important, that needs to be done quickly, and a way to support your team that does not include chipping away at your team's intrinsic motivation by ways of control. So we're going to talk about that. How do you actually coach your team and not control your team? Here's what works. As I mentioned, this is a much bigger framework that I'm only going to share a slice of with you today, but really the most foundational pieces of this. As a whole, the best way to describe this framework of what does work fundamentally, how do you coach and not control your team, is a concept that is called being autonomy supportive. And this is what the psychologist Edward Deci, who I mentioned, found in his research. He most famously did a study with Xerox Corporation with about 1,000 managers in that organization and tallied the effects of all the different kinds of actions the managers made and then compared it to the outcomes of those teams. And he found that the highest performing managers, they did a group of actions that he called autonomy supportive, which essentially means that these managers are wanting to support and encourage the individual's sense of freedom, self-efficacy, and autonomy, right? Now, specifically, what does that mean? Well, I'll show you in a second, right? Here are the 4 ways that you can think about being autonomy supportive and actually coaching and not controlling your team. The first is actually to recognize the root cause and to do a little bit of self-reflection for yourself of what is causing you as a manager to automatically kick into this gear of thinking that you need to exert all this control and pressure. And what we don't realize is the pressure that we put on our teams, the deadlines, the saying ASAP, you've got to do this, next thing, right? That pressure we put on our team, that's actually coming from somewhere. And usually for us as managers, that pressure is actually coming from our boss, right? Or if we're a CEO, that pressure is actually coming from our board member. And for the board members, that pressure is maybe coming from some, right? And it just goes, and it's this, almost hilarious or ripple effect, right? Of pressure begets pressure, which is all the pressure that we are feeling that we feel like needs to be put on to our employees to get something done is all coming from somewhere else. And so we have to first recognize that this is the case, that this is a pattern, and that what we're in fact doing when we are pressuring our employees to get something done and unintentionally chipping away at their intrinsic motivation is that that's actually pressure that was put onto us that we're therefore transferring onto our team. And so ask yourself as a leader, right? And if you're watching this today, what is your pressure that you are feeling, the control that you exert on your team in reaction to? And usually it's in reaction to a few things, which is the lack of control that we often have as managers, right? Which is that we need our team to do a thing and we're not the ones doing it, right? So all of a sudden there's this lack of control, right? There's a lot of moving pieces. And so because we feel this lack of control, we feel like, oh, we need to have tighter timelines. I need to be checking in more often. I need to have penalties for certain things not happening. We're going to have this many meetings. We're going to talk, we're going to have this, whatever, right? It's in response to this feeling of a lack of control. The other reaction that a lot of times our control is coming from is this deep-seated worry and fear of, oh, if this goes wrong, right? If this goes wrong, if this project fails, if my team isn't able to get this done, my job is on the line, my reputation's on the line, and that worry and fear means that all of a sudden we increase the amount of control and pressure we exert on our team. Additionally, a lot of times, and we don't always realize this until sort of taking a minute to take a step back, which is that the pressure that we often put on our team and the control that we exert is a learned motion. And sometimes it's our previous boss that we had who used to run meetings in a certain way, who used to check in on the team in a certain way, who you have sort of done a copy and paste in terms of their habits onto your own team. And they're not maybe necessarily productive, but that's just sort of what you know, and that's what you've been doing, right? And so just understanding that maybe some of your controlling habits are coming from a learned previous experience. The other thing, and this is maybe the most common sort of situation for you as a manager, and you may be thinking this, which is that you think, Claire, I have no alternative, right? There's no better way to get this thing done. It's got to get done at a certain time, and it just needs to happen. I can't think of another way other than putting strict deadlines and checking in on people, at a certain number of times and sort of pressuring folks to do something. I just don't know if there's a better way to do that. And then the last reason that a lot of times we as leaders feel like we need to control and put pressure is because we actually don't really know what kind of progress is being made in the team. We don't know where something's at. We don't know how far someone is away from completing something, right? And therefore, we feel like we don't have control. We feel like we are worried and fearful, right? And our tendency to control is only exacerbated. And so, this actual last potential root cause, I really want to zoom in on this idea that we often control because we don't know what's going on in the team, because it's actually a very straightforward problem to address. Of all the ways to be autonomy supportive, right? I think this is the one that can really really shine a light onto the fact that there's a better path to being autonomy supportive, which is the fact that we have to create a system then to make sure that progress is being made. So if you feel this feeling of, I have a lack of control, I don't know what's going on, I need to put more pressure and control, instead of thinking, I need to set stronger deadlines, we need to have more meetings, I need to make more recommendations and mandates for how someone should do something, instead of resorting to controlling mechanisms, instead think about how are you actually helping progress be made. And actually in Know Your Team, we have a tool to do this. It's called our Heartbeat Check-in, where it gives automatic status updates. But you also don't have to necessarily use Know Your Team. This is just one example of a system to help you really think about, how am I making progress clear? That way I feel like I don't need to control as much, right? So just recognizing that root cause, where it's coming from, and that figuring out what progress can be made and making that transparent is a true answer. Now for the second piece, what's a second way that we can be autonomy supportive as leaders? The second way is really actually understanding this concept of what I call, a wonderful and extremely well-known organizational scholar, his name's Edgar Schein, calls the imbalance of help, which is, and Edgar Schein, he's phenomenal. He's been researching and studying leadership for the past, 40 some years. He often describes coaching as helping, right? And I think all of us here would allude to that or prescribe to that today, is that at the end of the day, it's helping someone. And yet when you help someone, there's this really interesting imbalance that happens, which is that when you have someone who is asking for help, right? So this might be maybe yourself at some point, or it could be a direct report. When you're someone who's asking for help, you are one down, so to speak, right? You're in a vulnerable place. You are in a place where, you're worried about the way someone's perceiving you for asking for that help. And so you actually feel like your sense of power or status is reduced, versus if you're the one giving help, you are the expert, right? You are the person in charge. You are what someone would describe in a relationship, dynamic as being one up, right? So if you're the giver of help, you're sort of one up. If you're receiving help, it's a little bit more vulnerable. And what this means is that when you are trying to help someone, right, there's a power dynamic that's happening, which is that the person who's asking for help, your employee, is actually feeling nervous, is actually feeling like maybe they don't know anything, maybe they've actually done something wrong, right? And for you as the manager, it's actually inflating and increasing your status of power, which altogether means that when you try to help someone, you have to consider this dynamic in play, right? It means that you have to figure out what role to take in order to address the imbalance. So there's a few ways to think about this that Sheen describes. One is the fact that you can give coaching and you can give advice in a direct way, right? You can tell someone what to do. This is actually a lot of times what a doctor does, right? Is you tell them the problem. You say, hey, I need help, right? My elbow hurts, right? My knee hurts, whatever it is. And then they just tell you, oh, hey, we'll do A, B, and C, right? That's sort of a direct suggestion, right? And you have to figure out, okay, is it my place as a manager to be doing that, to be playing the role of doctor of, oh, you described your symptoms and now I'm just going to solve it? Or are you more in a place where you need to give advice or suggestion? And this is often what a friend might do, right? Which is, someone comes to you with a problem and you say, oh, well, maybe you should, you should think about A, B, and C, right? Or X, Y, and Z, right? And for your role as a manager, you have to think, okay, is my role based off the power dynamics, the fact that I should just be giving someone the suggestion, or do you need to be more what's called process consultative, which is that you're not necessarily just telling someone what they should do, nor are you giving them even options of what to do, but you're helping them think through the question themselves. And for the most effective managers, in order to most properly address the power imbalance, in order to make sure that someone isn't feeling put one down and you're not just put one up, and that's affecting the flow of information of what's happening, you should take this role of more helping the person think through for themselves what the answer should be. And when you can do that, when you can think of coaching as understanding that you're helping the person think through the process rather than just telling them the answer, that helps address that imbalance and that helps create a more autonomy, supportive environment for your team. So that's the second piece of thinking about how to best coach and not control your team. The third is the fact that the words that you're using, the controlling language that we so often default to as managers, does not have to be the case, and that we can use alternative language. We can say goodbye to what I call pressure words. So when we say, do this ASAP, this is urgent, you should do this, right? All of these words incite pressure, and yet they are not the only ways to say that something needs to get done quickly. For example, instead of saying ASAP, you can actually ask the person, hey, is this deadline reasonable? Or what trade-off will we need to make in order for this to be delivered by a certain time? Or how about, what can I take off your plate so that we can accomplish this? Instead of just telling someone, hey, we should do this, right? This is the path that we should take, right? It's what actually would be called a directive. There are other ways to recommend different paths, right? Or to be more process consultative. So for example, we can ask, what is your opinion on how to move forward? Or what do you think is the best way to approach this? Or what advice would you give me if you were in my position? We don't always have to resort to just saying, hey, you have to do this thing, right? Another controlling phrase that we often find ourselves sharing is just saying to someone, hey, these are the goals, right? These are your priorities. These are the things you have to focus on. Instead, we can ask, hey, what goals are you actually excited about achieving? Or what should the team accomplish that you would actually be proud of? Or what kind of work would make you feel energized that you're glad that you did that? And instead of guilting someone and creating pressure, right, by using this phrase of, hey, we're counting on you to do this, we can say things like, hey, excellent work on this. And just say that the work was excellent, right? We don't need to guilt them into continuing to do that. Just praise them for the work itself, right? And not tie it to something conditional. Or how about just saying, hey, you did something better than I could have, right? Again, not trying to absolve someone in the guilt in order to pressure them to do better work, right? Just complimenting them and just letting them know how much better that they actually made the team. So avoid and replace that controlling language. And then the fourth piece of thinking about how to actually be autonomy supportive, how to coach a team instead of control them, is to give choice, 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 choice. Because when you give choice, right? When you give someone options for how to do their work, they're actually enabled to do better work. When you are giving choice, you are truly creating that opportunity and environment to be autonomy supportive. And now giving choice can actually be in the smallest of ways, right? I'm not talking about, oh, they just get to choose their entire job description and every single project that they work on. I mean, if you can afford that and do that, great, right? But a lot of times as managers, that's maybe not within our purview, within our scope. And so there are other ways to give choice, which is literally, it could be as small as ensuring what time of day would you prefer one-on-one meetings? How often would you like me to check in before projects due? How do you prefer actually to receive feedback? You can also give choice by asking questions about success, about how a project should be going, instead of just making statements. And so here are a ton of suggestions on how to do that. So for example, when you are trying to get clear about success, communication, etc., we can ask questions around all of these pieces. We can ask questions on how to clarify communication. We can ask questions on how to gauge sentiment and questions to overcome blockers. And so we have a tool in Know Your Team to do this, but again, you don't have to use it. It's all about trying to give as much choice as possible through questions and through as many options as you can share with your team.